One of the most brilliant things about reading Dostoevsky is not just his complex Russian, somewhat tragic and depressing narratives, but also its sheer complexity and scale. Unlike a lot of novels which have a clear beginning, middle, and ending with a clear resolution, for example, The Lord of the Rings, when Frodo heads off to the Great Havens, in Dostoevsky's works, especially the Brothers Karamazov, oftentimes you end the novel while thinking, well, I'm not exactly sure where this is meant to go. I'm not sure who is the hero, who is the villain. Some scholars like to say Dmitri is more sympathetic than others. Some people say Ivan's arguments win the day at the end and Alyosha can't respond to them. Other people, of course, orthodox reading would be to say Alyosha wins the novel. But that sheer diversity of views and interpretations of Dostoevsky's works goes to show how diverse and complex these novels are in comparison to some other fictions. And this is not necessarily something to say other fictions are bad and Dostoevsky's a genius, but part of Dostoevsky's genius is that complexity. And in this video, I'm going to be describing to you why it is so complex and also what Dostoevsky is doing, hopefully helping you read and understand Dostoevsky a bit better. And the text that we're going to be looking into, or what I'm borrowing from, is the very famous work by Mikhail Bakhtin called The Problem of Dostoevsky's Poetics, and in which he introduces the polyphonic novel, the concept that stories do not need to have a certain narrative structure in which it all fits under one story, but rather there could be numerous voices bouncing off each other, which are all independent from the author. There is no grand narrative to the story. So this video, we're going to start off by talking about, well, where does this idea of polyphony come from? Where does Bakhtin get his ideas from? We're going to talk about how this applies to Dostoevsky. And then we're going to also see about, well, what does this mean for readers when we're engaging with him? Because I know a lot of people like me making Dostoevsky videos, and I do quite a lot of research on Dostoevsky as well. So I hope you find this helpful. So where does this idea of polyphony come from? Well, polyphony comes from this idea by Mikhail Bakhtin, as I've said, on Dostoevsky's Poetics. Dostoevsky's Poetics in this book, he's just talking about, well, Dostoevsky is such a genius, but why is that the case? How is this novel structured? It's not only the case that his prose is good, and in fact, his prose is oftentimes really horrible to read and horrible and dry to read, especially in the English translation. But it's also the case that, well, there are parts of this narrative which seem to be way more complex and way more diverse than normal pieces or normal novels that you read. And I gave an example of Lord of the Rings versus Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, which is the one that people talk about the most. And you can see why there is that difference. Lord of the Rings, take Harry Potter, or take any other novel which is a bit more simplistic. I mean, yes, it's a beautiful novel, but of course the storyline is okay, good fights against evil, evil falls, good wins. Same with Harry Potter, Voldemort gets destroyed. However, with Dostoevsky, you notice that, well, there isn't one side that wins. Ivan doesn't come out victorious necessarily. Dmitri doesn't come out victorious necessarily, and neither does Alyosha in many senses. Of course, there's that religious sympathies or that vision of Alyosha, which I do think is how I read it, and we'll get back to this in a bit. But what is the case with Mikhail Bakhtin's analysis? You say, well, the fact that there's so many different voices in this novel, you don't really have just this good over evil narrative, or this certain narrative that's moving through, or the characters just building on that narrative. You get what in music people call a polyphonic harmony, a polyphonic harmony. When you get in music, you often have notes or songs which are monophonic. So if you get a piano and you just like play some melody like dun 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 dun, that would be a monophonic tune because there's one tune. However, a polyphonic tune would be, imagine I go I have the same song like of course I can't sing a polyphonic tune because that means I'll have to make two noises, but you could very easily imagine how one person is singing a song at once, but at the same time he's playing another melody. So it's like da 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 da, and the other guy's like da 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 da, and then I'm not sure how that were layered over each other, but you could get the view. There's numerous voices at the same time going on with their independent melodies. And that leads to this polyphonic structure in music, which Bakhtin is trying to borrow from. So he's saying, well, in music, you get these numerous melodies interwoven together, but on top of each other, forming this narrative or this piece. And therefore, you get a polyphonic music. And in the same way, in Dostoevsky, that he's talking about, and in polyphonic novels, you get that mix, that depth of voices and worldviews in that novel, and they're all clashing against each other. And in some sense, that is more human in various ways. And this is the argument that a lot of people give for Dostoevsky's realism. Why is Dostoevsky so why do people love Dostoevsky so much? He's not the best prose writer, as I've mentioned. He's not necessarily the most wonderful, clear writer, or has poetry as good as Tolkien or other writings. But why do people love Dostoevsky so much? It's because people could empathize directly with a certain character. Not that you can't empathize with another character in another book, but you could almost imagine that being real life, because the world we live in is polyphonic in a very real sense. Of course, if you're religious, you think God's creating the world for a higher good and we're all working towards it. But if you get rid of that metaphysical picture, I have my opinions, I have my worldview, I have my frameworks. My friend Joe has his own frameworks. My friend Alina has her frameworks. A lot of my different friends have their different frameworks. And when you have those frameworks, you then develop into it's a polyphonic world that we live in. And oftentimes you have contradictory ideas. Of course, some people will be close together, but there's also very widely different people. So, for example, Adolf Hitler versus, Mother Teresa. They're very different people, but then they're all part of the same world, and the world is that mixing together. Or Maximilian Kolbe, perhaps, is that mixing together in kind of Nazi Germany. So the world is a polyphonic novel in many ways, and Dostoevsky is trying to integrate that into his writing, and you can view that from his love for anthropology, because he loves starting off with journalism. One thing which was Dostoevsky really liked to do in his research, in his writing, he would start off with understanding humans and then building the stories out of them, and then he would read something in the newspaper and write a story about that. You could imagine when Ivan Karamazov in Rebellion says, well, I was reading these stories in the news, this horrible thing about the Turks or whatnot, very much coming from his real understanding of human beings. So we have these characters which are developed independently in Dostoevsky, and they all resemble different worldviews, because people aren't just going to follow a certain narrative. People are complex. They have comprehensive positions, and this is one thing which is important to note in polyphonic novels when you're reading them, is that that characters are meant to be fully articulated. They're meant to not only have just a certain argument or certain idea, but they're meant to have a whole backing, a whole background, a whole lifestyle, a context in which they're situating, that they're speaking out of. Not to say that other monophonic characters don't have a background or a context, but the fact that they can hold an independent position independently from the main narrative of the story, which is why a lot of people criticize Dostoevsky's novels for being messy, is because, well, he doesn't want to write a monophonic narrative. Life is messy, and Dostoevsky represents that messiness of life very well. And, well, how do we see this in Dostoevsky's works? It's something that, of course, we've looked at the Brothers Karamazov as the main example of it, and you can see why. You look at, I have two copies. I have the Pivar and then a Penguin edition up there, so actually two Brothers Karamazovs back there. But you get a lot of people reading through the Brothers Karamazov, and you're like, well, Alyosha seems to be very sympathetic, but he doesn't really respond fully or very well to Ivan's arguments. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. That's a point of disagreement between people. But what you are seeing is, you have a lot of these different voices engaging with each other. And when you get to the end of the Brothers Karamazov, you don't get a completion. It's not, the Brothers Karamazov doesn't end as a whole, a unifying whole. It's not a victory of good over evil. Of course, the whole novel was meant by Dostoevsky to be a response to Ivan's challenge. But still, at the end, you read it and you're like, well, yeah, I can see why it's a response, but it's not a full response. I could still be a materialist or a realist or something else. But that's not the only book in which you see traces of polyphony. Of course, you have other books which are a bit more monophonic. The Idiot, for example, some people say is a bit more monophonic, but nonetheless, you could still see that ambiguity towards the end. And this ambiguity is important for polyphony because there's that ambiguity towards the end of The Idiot where you're like, yes, Mushkin is clearly this moral exemplar, but is he really the victor in this narrative? He goes kind of insane. In the same way, you read Demons. Of course, it's a criticism of social the violence of these revolutionary groups. Of course, that argument's relatively clear. But does the book end with one side, or at least these characters being like very clear, following and building up to that? Well, yes, you could argue they all are just kind of like an expression of this revolutionary mode. And that's why it's more monophonic than the Brothers Karamazov. But you can still see why, well, there's actually differences between these positions. There's the revolutionary theist. There's the Feuerbachian atheist in Kirillov. You got all these different figures in that. From that perspective, they're not coming from it from the same angle. Of course, there's similarities, they're building into the narrative, but they also have their unique voices. And in this sense, you can see how polyphony, I would argue, develops throughout Dostoevsky's works and reaches the climax in the Brothers Karamazov. Now, you could also argue that, well, maybe the reason why polyphony is the case in the Brothers Karamazov is because Dostoevsky intended to write a sequel to, and maybe if we did read the sequel back to back, the two volumes next to each other, it might actually be a monophonic novel. That could be a case, but of course that's speculative. The Brothers Karamazov, as it is highly polyphonic. And when you engage with it, and this is the point of, well, when you're reading this, how should you read the Brothers Karamazov? How should you understand Dostoevsky, which is why I'm expecting you watching this video? Well, first, you should expect this ambiguity. It's not how you read a normal plot line where it's, okay, beginning, middle, and end. It builds up and then drops. Dostoevsky does very well to always make it high, drama, drop, high again, and then drop, and then high again, and then drop. And it kind of just like peters out to the end, and you're like, well, what happened there? What is the point of this? There is no clear victory or resolution within Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov. When you get to the end in the chapter, there's the speech at the stone in the epilogue, when they sing hurrah for Karamazov, you don't really know exactly why that is the case. You don't know exactly why or who they're hurrahing for. Of course, it's hurrah for Alyosha in some sense. But or is it the story that the brothers had for each other? Because when you remember, the whole emphasis of Alyosha's speech at the end was to say, well, we need to remember the fraternity that we shared with our brothers, talking about Ilyusha's funeral. So in many senses, you have this diversity of views and this potential for interpretation, which is very broad. And that's what the polyphonic novel is meant to do. It's not meant to force you down a certain path in interpretation. It is meant to promote you to think about what's the truth, to think about, well, okay, is what I'm reading the best way to interpret this? But it's also there for you to question yourself constantly without really getting an answer. What is beautiful about this is it's providing you, if you could think of it in this way, with different voices in which it engages with society. In the same way, we look through the news and we see different people acting for different motives. And we sometimes think, well, why was a person acting like you read something ridiculous and you're like, I want to understand what was going through their mind. The polyphonic novel's meant to do the same thing. You're meant to be thinking about, what is Alyosha saying? Why is Alyosha saying what it is? What's his worldview? How's he responding to some stimuli? How is Ivan responding to the same stimuli? How should I respond to the same stimuli? In many senses, it's if you threw a group of kids onto an island and say, well, you guys are all there, play around all you want, enjoy time with each other. You have all the people there on the island. Examine what happens, and they all will express their own worldviews. And the brilliance of Dostoevsky is it invites you to put yourself as a voice alongside those worldviews. Because arguments aren't just a singular position. Arguments are part of a larger scale of assumptions, criterion, commitments, metaphysical commitments, theological commitments, moral commitments, emotive commitments. You get a lot of these commitments, and by engaging with these commitments of each of these characters, you then can read the novel in a different way. It's almost a therapeutic, an existential, almost a truly existential novel, because it places you within that landscape. That's why Dostoevsky's Poetics is so fascinating, and why Dostoevsky is so difficult to read, because no one really has a right answer or a wrong answer. You could read it to say Ivan wins, you could read it to say Alyosha wins, you could read it to say Dmitri wins. But then that's an open-ended question for you to really engage with yourself. And of course, Dostoevsky's narrative views lie on top. And you could say, well, he does have one argument for orthodoxy that he wants to present, sobernost. I'm probably butchered that, but it's the idea of unity and freedom that is collided together in the Orthodox vision. But still, it's not a complete one-way answer for a certain narrative or a certain view over the other. And that's the beauty of Dostoevsky's Poetics. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion or this introduction to Dostoevsky's Poetics and his polyphonic novel. If you have any more questions, let me know in the comments below. As always, if you want to check out Polyphony, learn more about it, you could check out the book Mikhail Bakhtin's the problem of Dostoevsky's Poetics, and of course read the Brothers Karamazov for a good example of that. Now, of course, this video, as always, is brought to you by Philosophy Circle. It's a platform started by me to bring you top quality philosophy tutorials, top quality philosophy guidance, and admissions advice. So if you're planning to apply for a degree in philosophy, or you just want to learn philosophy in an Oxford way, check out Philosophy Circle. It's kind of the platform that I provided. So I have an official way of helping you guys get into your dream universities, or just to develop your intellectual journey. Thank you very much. Stay safe. See you soon. Thank you for watching. And if you like this video and want more videos on Dostoevsky, let me know what topics you want me to discuss in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one.